Hello, welcome to the Carter Center online webcast. The Carter Center is hosting this event here at the National Organization of Women office in New York City, and we are very grateful to the NOW office here for hosting us this afternoon for this very important discussion on actual choices for women in the sex trade seeking to exit. We have a wonderful panel that we would like to introduce, and we're welcoming our online audience. Thank you very much for joining. This is occurring during the UN Commission on the Status of Women 63. This is the 63rd Commission on the Status of Women happening right here in New York. And we wanted to use this opportunity to speak with some of our friends who are really working very hard on ending sexual exploitation globally. So first, I would like to introduce our panel, but first I'm going to explain how the Carter Center came to be working on this issue. Former President Jimmy Carter has worked on human rights since before and since his presidency ended in 1981. He made human rights the center of his foreign policy. He appointed more women to the federal bench than any president of the United States before him and after him. He named Sandra Day O'Connor to the federal bench and many other notable women. He was a leading advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment during his administration and otherwise led the conversation with Mrs. Carter at the helm on equal rights for women during his administration. Since that time at the Carter Center, he has also, and Mrs. Carter have also, prioritized women's rights issues. And about 5 years ago, he decided it was time for him to write a book specifically on women's rights. And he gathered many, many ideas and issues and asked himself what would be the priority issues that he should deal with in this book. And he ended up saying that violence and discrimination against women is the most unaddressed and serious human rights violation on earth. This was his statement. And that he and the Carter Center would dedicate the future of our work to deal with this issue. And as I was working with him on this book, we were collecting ideas and what should we focus on. We discovered that something had happened a few years ago to really make a dent in the issue of human trafficking. That in Sweden, the law had been passed to really focus on gender equality in the area of sexual exploitation. And that the Swedish government and the people of Sweden had passed a law that would prioritize the well-being of women in the sex trade by decriminalizing women, but by penalizing male buyers and profiteers, that this would be the priority. But that in order for that to work, you would have to have public education on the inherent harms of prostitution, but also access for women to services so that they could exit and have true alternatives for their livelihood and for their well-being. So we were very excited to discover that this had been done in Sweden and that there were organizations dedicated to implementing this. And this is how we came to meet many survivors that you'll meet today and activists that are working on this issue. We also discovered this at a time when the calls for decriminalization of the sex trade, complete decriminalization, so full legalization, including sex buyers and pimps, was also being promoted as the solution. So we said to ourselves, what's going on here? What's the real solution, right? And so since then, we have been navigating this question and finding out, what do we really do about this? So it has been my honor, really, to meet some of the most wonderful women and men, but in particular survivors, who have been leading the way and making the case for what Sweden tried and is being perfected and worked on in other jurisdictions. So let me get right to it and introduce our panel. To my right and to the audience's left, we have Autumn Burris, who is the founding director of Survivors for Solutions, which advocates for peer-led services and programs and survivor-informed policies. A survivor of prostitution systems and multiple forms of violence against women, Autumn graduated from the University of California, San Diego, my hometown, by the way, yay. All right, with a bachelor's degree in political science and public policy and a minor in human rights. As a subject matter expert and survivor of sexual exploitation, Autumn's public policy advocacy experience includes working at the United Nations, in the British Parliament, the Global Conference to implement SDG 5, the SDG 5 target, 5.2 in Spain, legislative advocacy at the federal level, testifying on state legislation, and expert testimony in federal trafficking cases. Welcome, Autumn. Nikki Bell, also to my right here, is the founder of Living in Freedom Together, LIFT, nice acronym, a survivor-led organization that provides resources, advocacy, and support to empower individuals to exit and recover from the impacts of commercial sexual exploitation. A survivor of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, Nikki is committed to helping other women break free from the life that robbed her of 10 precious years and to help victims know that there is a way out. Welcome, Nikki. Ambassador Per-Anders SUNESSON is the Swedish ambassador at large for combating trafficking in persons. As a lawyer, Per-Anders has worked internationally and within Sweden for more than 20 years on social and criminal policies, crime victims issues, children's rights, legislation, and welfare systems. Formerly the head of department at the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs, Ambassador SUNESSON is now a driving force in efforts to strengthen the European Union's work to combat trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation. Welcome, Ambassador SUNESSON. And to my left as well is we are very proud to have Laura Huber, who is a graduate student, a graduate assistant, who has conducted research for us on this program that she's going to describe the learnings, what we have taken away from a very modest effort to learn about the accessibility of exit services for women seeking to exit the sex trade. Laura is a PhD candidate at Emory University in political science, and her topic of her PhD, or her focus, is the effects of international aid and conflict on women's rights. So we have a wonderful panel, and my name is Karen Ryan. I'm the Senior Advisor for Human Rights at the Carter Center and the Special Representative on Women and Girls. And I've been working with President Carter for, let's just say, a long time. I've stopped saying how many years, but it's a great honor to work with him and Mrs. Carter on these issues. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off this discussion by asking Laura to tell us what we learned, what we wanted to find out from this very modest effort. I have to say this because there are some really wonderful researchers in this field. And when we decided to look at the accessibility of exit services, we said, well, let's just ask all these organizations that say they work on human trafficking what services they provide. And we thought that would be a simple task, so we went about it. So Laura, tell us, how did we go about this, and what did we find on the Main?
Great, thank you, Karen. So as Karen said, to start off our panel today, I'm going to very briefly describe a survey that the Carter Center conducted in February of 2019, examining exit service provision for women who are seeking to leave the sex trade. The purpose of this survey was to gather information on NGOs that provide exit and care services designed for individuals seeking to leave the sex trade. We contacted a range of organizations that worked in this field, including those that only worked with victims of sex trafficking, as well as organizations that worked with women who entered the sex trade under other circumstances, but who now wanted to leave. We asked each organization several questions about their provision of exit services, including the type of clients they served, various organizational characteristics, and the main challenges they faced in the provision of exit services. The goal of this research was to provide a very broad overview of what is currently existing and the state of the field of exit service provision and advocacy, as well as the funding status of these organizations and these types of programs and initiatives. We want to be very clear that this is a broad first take look at these results, and we don't want to overstate the specificity of the results. However, we hope that this can act as a starting point to call for more research and attention to this topic. So we are greatly looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we can take this research forward and improve upon it in the future. To conduct this survey, we contacted about 520 organizations who worked within this field. And particularly here, we contacted organizations mostly based within the United States that worked on human trafficking, sexual exploitation, the sex trade or the sex industry, and so-called sex work. We also contacted the largest women's rights organizations, such as Global Fund for Women and CARE. The results that I'm going to be discussing today are based on about 158 responses that we received, which is about a 30.4% response rate, which is quite high for this type of survey. And responses are continuing to come in today, and so we're hoping to gather more information in the coming months. We do believe, though, that the organizations that chose to participate in this survey were not random, and they over-reflect certain types of organizations working on this issue. Particularly organizations that believe there is a separation between so-called sex work and sexual exploitation appear to have been less likely to participate in the survey. So keep this in mind as I'm discussing the results, that the survey likely overrepresents organizations that view all types or all participation in the sex trade as a form of exploitation. Additionally, organizations that did not offer exit services as their primary activity appear to be less likely to participate in the survey. And finally, the major women's rights organizations, with the exception of Planned Parenthood, did not participate. So now I will go over a broad snapshot of our results, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this in more detail after the panel. Overall, 90% of our respondents provide exit services and advocate for more exit services for women seeking to leave the sex trade. Furthermore, the provision of exit services was often the primary activity of these organizations. Around 50% of our respondents reported that exit services are their main activity, and 22% reported that it is more than half of their activities. And this holds true for both their staff resources as well as their budget. Importantly, 57% of the organizations surveyed reported that they only serve individuals who have been formally identified or self-identify as human trafficking victims. Further, around 43% of organizations surveyed only served adults, and whereas 12% only served minors. And these two findings call into question which women in the sex trade have access to these services, especially as many women may not self-identify as human trafficking victims. And it also calls into question which women are excluded or may fall through the cracks of the current service infrastructure. Additionally, as I'm sure Autumn and Nikki can comment more on, survivor leadership is extremely important in providing meaningful and successful exit services for women seeking to leave the sex trade. Therefore, we asked each organization what roles survivors play within their programming. Based on their self-reported results, 23% of the organizations reported that one of their executive leaders or their founders was a survivor, and 11% had survivors on their board. Additionally, 34% of organizations had survivors on their staff, and I apologize, that's missing from the summary sheet that we have, so just to repeat, 34%. 19% had survivors mentor their current clients, and an additional 17% had survivors volunteer with their organization. And finally, 9% reported that survivors who are currently participating in their programming get to lead and choose what types of services they receive. Generally, trafficking-specific organizations are less likely to have survivors in all of these types of survivor roles within their organization compared to organizations that serve both trafficking and non-trafficking victims. And it is also important to note that survivor-led organizations are far less likely to report that they only serve human trafficking victims. Specifically, while 42% of survivor-led organizations only serve human trafficking victims, that's compared to 65% of non-survivor-led organizations. And this begs a deeper conversation about how survivors are meaningfully incorporated into exit service provision and how survivor leadership can alter the character of exit services. We also asked about organizational views on the legalization of the sex trade. The majority of our sample believed that both the selling and the buying of sex should be illegal, whereas 43% believed that the buying of sex should be illegal, while the selling of sex should be legal. And finally, a small proportion, about 3%, supported full legalization. But again, we think that this may be because organizations that support full legalization chose not to participate in the survey. And it's important to note that survivor-led organizations are far more likely to support partial decriminalization compared to non-survivor-led organizations. We also asked organizations what their main challenges were in providing exit services. The number one challenge was a lack of funding, with about 41% of organizations reporting that they had trouble receiving funds. Second, 28% of organizations reported that there is a lack of safe, stable housing for their clients. About 16% said that they faced challenges with their participants leaving the program early in order to return to the life, to the sex trade, to the pimp, or to their trafficker. 11% reported that they needed more specialized services for their clients instead of more generalized services for women facing homelessness, sexual violence, addiction, etc. And finally, about 10% reported challenges serving a population with high levels of untreated mental health issues or drug and alcohol addictions. The challenges reported did differ across organization types. Survivor-led organizations, as well as organizations that serve both women who have been victims of trafficking, as well as women who entered the sex trade under other circumstances, are both more likely to report challenges in funding compared to their respective counterparts. Survivor-led organizations are also less likely to report problems with women returning to the life compared to non-survivor-led organizations. And non-trafficking specific organizations were also more likely to report a greater need for specialized services for their clients. We also asked organizations to choose from a list of descriptors that best characterized their organization. Around half identified as faith-based, while 20% identified as secular. Further, 31% reported that they were survivor-led, 78% reported that they were anti-human trafficking, and 26% identified as abolitionist. And survivor-led organizations were 3 times more likely to identify as abolitionist. Further, 44% of our respondents were grassroots organizations, whereas 27% operated on the national level and 17% operated internationally. Additionally, we asked what types of services these organizations offered. There were about 30 options to choose from, but the most common responses were organizations that offered clothing assistance, accompaniment to appointments, information and referrals, life skills training, and case management. And this leads us to wonder whether the services being offered are truly those most needed by women seeking to exit the sex trade, and if there are any gaps or complementarities that are missing. And finally, we asked our organizations from which types of sources they had received funding. Almost 90% of respondents had received donations from private donors, followed by 78% who received donations from charitable foundations, and slightly more than 60% who had received donations from faith groups. Importantly, only 38% had received funding from local governments, and only 22% had received donations from the national government. And as noted, Funding is the #1 challenge faced by these organizations. These results may be a good starting point for us to wonder how we can provide sustainable funds for exit services and which actors should be responsible for providing those funds. Additionally, we must critically consider which organizations are receiving these funds and how the funds are translated into meaningful and successful exit services for women leaving the sex trade. We must also further examine which women may not be eligible or may not be able to fully access exit services that are currently available. And finally, these results demonstrate that there needs to be more detailed research and attention paid to exit services as a necessary component ensuring that women have actual choices within and outside of the sex trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was excellent. And of course, I want to give the first word to Nikki and Autumn to react to just what are the obstacles we talked about in preparing for this panel. From real in the trenches experience, what are the real obstacles to making sure that women have actual choice? I start with you, Nikki.
So it was interesting to me when it was like survivors not ready, right? So like we're saying they're not ready. We're not saying that we're not providing them the necessary resources, right? Like when we're talking about, you know, the most common resource offered is clothing assistance, right? So when we're looking at that and then we're saying survivors aren't ready, right? So maybe it's that we're not providing them with real economic opportunity, right? We're not providing them with safe housing. We're not providing them with the things that they need to exit the life. So it's not that they're not ready, it's that we're not providing them with the necessary resources that they need to exit, right? I mean, when, you know, our primary resource that we're providing people is clothing, like that's problematic. I mean, these women are coming out of poverty, they're coming out of violence, and so, I mean, though clothing is helpful, I mean, we offer clothing, but that's not like the main staple of like the services that we're providing, right? Because we actually, are trying to help women exit. And so what happens is like we have these organizations, and I'm not speaking to anybody in particular or one or another, but it's like we're, telling women that they should exit the life and then, connecting them to public assistance, which equivalates to like not even being able to buy groceries, right? And then wondering why they're returning to prostitution, right? So I think like, looking at some of these, results is kind of like really, telling that we're not providing what women need to exit.
Can you talk about your program and what you're doing, how you're going about it?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit organization that provides resources, advocacy, and support to empower individuals to exit. And we're looking at this like, holistically, right? We recognize that like, though clothing is a need, the reason that we're providing that at the drop-in center is to build relationships with people, right? Because we understand that if people, understand that they're cared about wherever they are in that journey, whether that's in the life, whether that's out of the life, that then it makes them much more likely to make the scary changes necessary to exit prostitution. Some of our goals that we're working on now is we're opening, like where we are, we see a lot of our women are overwhelmingly burdened with substance use disorder. It's like over 90% of the population that we serve in Worcester it's tied into substance use disorder. And I just want to be clear, that doesn't mean that this is happening because of their addiction. They're not in prostitution because of their addiction. I also want to be clear that most of our participants have had to exchange sex for drugs, money, a place to stay, whatever that may be, prior to using drugs, right? So the substance use disorder is a symptom of the exploitation for many of our women. And I just want to lay that out there because then, we get this narrative of, it's all about the drugs and they're out there, living this crazy lifestyle, if we don't clarify that. So one of our programs that we're working on right now is a residential program to treat substance use disorder, but specific for survivors of prostitution, where we will provide life skills and job training, give them educational opportunity, and things that they need in order to exit prostitution. We also do a lot of like those other things. We offer clothing. We work with our criminal justice system. We're starting a diversion program where women will not be criminalized within prostitution. We also have a partner and run the John School, Worcester, Mass. And so we do a lot of different things. Run a political education program in the prison system that we have work within. So we do a lot of different things for participants.
Can you just say how many clients, constituents, beneficiaries, how many people do you work with in general? Is it, what's your group like?
So we have worked with over 160 different women in prostitution in various places, be it the jail, be it the court system, be it the drop-in center. And I also think it's interesting, we ask, I always have to say this, because, you know, for people that think that prostitution is so fun, we ask our women, like, do you want to exit prostitution? We have not got one person that says no. So I think that's pretty telling as to, like, what, you know, right, the reality that this is like a glamorous life. If it is so great, why does everybody want out so badly, right?
Well said, and I'm going to come back to you with more on that. But Autumn, talk to us about what you think are the main obstacles to really being able to make appropriate services available to women so that they're able to know. If all of them want to leave, why can't we get the services put together to make that happen?
Thank you, Karen. I think one of the things on this study in particular, although I do realize it's preliminary, is that the point here where it says, do your clients have to be identified as a human trafficking victim? So 53.2%, so just slightly over half, said yes. And I think the problem with that is under the federal definition in some states, it's force, fraud, or coercion, or automatically if you're under 18. So what that seems like to me is that we've got a whole bunch of people falling through the cracks, particularly women and girls, and particularly women and girls of color, because individuals involved in the sex trade do not self-identify, as you mentioned, and so they don't identify as a trafficking victim. And so I think the other part of the process here is really about, like, in our intake process, if you said, is there force, fraud, or coercion, and you check off, are you under 18, and you check off no, and you're like, okay, and you don't provide any referrals. But the real problem I see here is how you define coercion. Because the way coercion gets defined is far too narrow from a programmatic and governmental standpoint. So if I have, coercion could be economic, it could be a lot of social, it could be a lot of different things. So if a woman is a single parent, for example, and she has a choice to put a roof over her and her child's head and have dinner that night, and the only way that she can do that because of lack of education, because of her environment, because of poverty, because of racial inequality, gender inequality, all of these things, then that's not really a choice. And it is literally coercion. So I think we need to broaden that definition of coercion. Service providers need to understand that, and most importantly, come from a place of being able to provide a good referral base. And that's one of my main takeaways from the study, so thank you.
Yeah, and to both of you, why do you think survivor-led organizations have such a hard time getting funded? What do you think that is about? And are, having the personal experience and the knowledge is such an asset to be able to design appropriate programs. So do you have any thoughts about why? And before we end this discussion, I want to think about any action items that we can take away and send to our friend, the ambassador from Sweden here, and to other governments. What can be done to reverse that problem?
Autumn and I were looking this over, and it's like even looking at survivor roles in organizations, right? Like we're having survivors volunteer or as consultants, right? Because we're not going to actually give you a job with benefits and a retirement policy, right? God forbid that, right? And so looking at even this, right? And it feels like and I'm just going to speak transparently, right? Like, we're good enough to speak at your events, but we're not good enough to trust, like, we can't be trusted with your money. I mean, right? Like, that's really what it's about. And, like, I'm just going to put that out there for a lot of people, right? It's like this idea of, like, funding organizations, though, like, we're really the ones that are providing the support services to people. We're the ones that are doing these things. And it's like trying to get money and also, like, because we don't buy into the decrim narrative, right? So when you're looking at, like, government entities, a lot of people have a hard time, like, we're not going to support policies that, like, are giving sex buyers, a free pass and pimping, right? So a lot of the money trickling down is coming from organizations or places that want you to support that narrative. So that's my thought process on it. Maybe it's more accurate, but
Well, I mean, Survivors for Solutions exists to promote and help sustain, in even the smallest ways, peer-led programming. And the reason is because I wouldn't be sitting here right now if I didn't have the late Norma Hotelling sit across from me in a business suit, and I'll just keep it at I wasn't in a business suit, and tell me that I could be where she was one day. And the rapport and the trust was built much quicker because all the therapists in the world and all the case managers in the world, my answer to them always was, oh, really? So when's the last time you did X, Y, or Z, right? So sometimes the women and girls that I've worked with have very much that mentality. And at least we can say as survivor-led organizations, oh yeah, we understand about that, right? And I think it helps give hope, and I think that it helps get a comfort level. And I think in terms of, like, trying to refer someone, when I get a call, I clearly understand if I can't get that woman safe tonight, whatever that takes and whatever that looks like, I know that that could be the last time that woman walks on planet Earth. And every survivor that I work with feels the same way. If we've got to scramble together money, get her in a hotel, whatever we've got to do, we've got to get that person when they're ready. We've got to have the resources to do that. And survivors get that. And survivor-led programs get that. And so I'm not saying that other programs don't. I just think that, like, from a heart level, the urgency is very different from a non-survivor organization. So if I look at, if I look at this, this data, and it says, are you survivor-led or survivor-informed? Well, you've got 47.5% that are survivor-informed. That means you either hired or had them volunteer to inform your organization. I'm talking particularly on service providers here. Versus the 7.6% that are survivor-led. I mean, that is a huge disparity there. And the reason we don't get funding is just like Nikki said, I am a expert consultant with the Office of Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. They don't like my language. So if I want to contract with them, I've got to change my language. And I mean, let's face it, folks, we've already got problems with language. Prostitution is where sex trafficking happens, period, end of story. That's a quote from Dr. Melissa Farley. We can't forget where this happens, and we have to use the word prostitution, and we have to have the government be able to understand that it's okay to call it what it is, and have organizations be okay to call it what it is, because it's not always someone thrown chained up and thrown in the back of a car or a back of the white van, the notorious white van, and that's how trafficking happens. It's not even happening like that. It's happening by adults buying women and children and girls, and largely women and girls of color.
So language is important, getting our terminology right. So now I want to ask our guest, Ambassador SUNESSON, when Sweden passed this law and incorporated this element, the access to exit exit services. You know, it really was a brilliant idea. And from what I understand, the idea was that the law would address gender inequality. And so in order for that to be equal, you had to give women a choice. So you know, I think we're all grateful that that example has been set. So can you talk about that? Talk about how it's working in Sweden. Also, what is your mandate, and how are you bringing this message of how we're going to solve this to here at the UN and other places that you're traveling to?
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. First of all, I'm very happy to be here representing the Swedish feminist government, and also happy that we have been able to co-sponsor this event. The discussion we're having tonight or this afternoon is crucial also for my assignment, and I will get back to that. But first of all, let me say that I was appointed in May 2016. My function is a new function within the Swedish government. There's not been an ambassador at large combating human trafficking before. And the reason why my government thought or actually saw the need for a person working 100% on these issues is, you know, push back against women's rights, the fact that there are more and more people being trafficked, and also the fact that there is a lobby out there arguing that prostitution should be considered a job, like any other job. And from my government, who sees, you know, prostitution as always being exploitation of someone's vulnerability, that is really, really problematic. So very short, you know, we've had this legislation for 20 years. It's a 20-year celebration this year. And before it came into force, there was a discussion in Sweden for many years. Prostitution was not illegal. And actually, way back there was no discussion about prostitution, actually. There was the women's lobby were, you know, talking to the government saying, you need to do something about men's violence against women. You need to do something about gender inequality in the Swedish society. And after a while, governments did what governments do. They put together a governmental inquiry to look into the structures behind men's violence against women and gender inequality in the society. And it was during this inquiry that the issue of prostitution came up for the really first time in the Swedish debate, because people saw that there was a lot of violence going on against women in prostitution, and of course, you know, the gender imbalance, because it was mostly men using their economic power to buy access to women's bodies. So the women's movement started saying to the government, you need to do something about this, we need to look into this. And the government put together another governmental inquiry, like governments do. And they did a really thorough job, because they spoke to almost everyone who was in prostitution back then in Sweden, and it was almost 100% Swedish girls. And they also talked to a lot of Johns. And the findings were that almost everyone of the girls in prostitution back then had a documented history of sexual abuse within the family, drug abuse, that kind of problems. So, you know, the picture was not, these are, you know, girls, women who are strong entrepreneurs. No, on the contrary, these are girls, women that, you know, have very low self-esteem. They don't think they are worth anything else, and that's, you know, why they ended up in this. And you know, when they were asked if this was their choice, no one said, yes, this is my choice. And looking at the results from interviewing the Johns, it was, you heard this many times, well, I'm a man and I have my sexual needs and I don't have a girlfriend and someone needs to take care of it. It's a human right to have sex, right? Or, you know, I like these pornos and my wife don't want to do what they do on pornos, so I need someone to you know, fulfill my dreams, so on. And also, you know, ugly things like, you know, they are lazy, they don't want to get an education and this is all they can do when we're actually doing them a favor. So there was a big outcry in the Swedish society regarding this, and people were upset. So then there was this discussion, and the government said, no, we don't want prostitution in our society because it's not coherent with, you know, striving for gender equality and also for stopping men's violence against women. And there were voices saying, okay, let's criminalize both the buyer and the seller. But then there were some people raising their hands saying, remember the results from the governmental inquiry. These are victims, and it would be just wrong to criminalize them. We should instead, our society should instead provide for them, give them exit services, help them leave this, give them choices. So this was, you know, decided back then, and 1st of January 1999, the law came into force. And another reason for having this function is, you know, that people who are arguing that prostitution should be considered a job, they are talking about the Swedish law like saying that it's a super dangerous law, the effects are really bad. Actually, before coming here tonight, this afternoon, I went to this side event that UNDP arranged, Let's Talk About Sex Work. And I went in there and they didn't know who I was, and I was just listening to the panelists, and also the representative from the UN organization was saying exactly, quote, you know, the Swedish legislation is really dangerous for you sex workers. We will do everything in our power to stand behind you and, you know, and help you be recognized.
This was the UN person.
Yes. So anyway, after all the panelists, I raised my hand and I told them who I was, and I just gave them my view, or the Swedish view on Swedish legislation. And the fact is that for us, it's worked very, very well. Street prostitution was cut in half right away when the law came into force, and it's diminished ever since. Let's see, talking to the police and talking to those who are in prostitution in Sweden now, they say, no, it didn't get more dangerous for us. Actually, it got more safe because the mindset of Swedish people changed. Very few thinks it's okay to buy sex. And if I were to go out and buy sex in Stockholm today, I would be, you know, super scared that someone would find out. I would lose my job, my face, I would go to jail. So, if I go to someone in prostitution, I will make sure not to do anything that will make that person call the police, right? Because the police would come and pick me up right away. So this law kind of changed the power from the buyer to the person who is in prostitution, right? And actually made it safer. And we haven't had one violent crime reported to someone in prostitution since the law came into force. And not one murder, of course. So it really worked out well for us, the law. And you all know that since our law came into force, several countries have followed this example. You have Canada, you have Norway, Iceland, Northern Ireland, Ireland, France, and now you also have Israel. And we are having good discussions. There are big interest from the Spain government, from Greece, several members of parliament in the UK, and quite a few other countries who actually are looking into this. And you know, I think as a lawyer, I have the greatest case in the world, because just compare the results in Sweden with our neighboring country, Germany, where you went the other way and said, well, this is the oldest profession in the world. Let's have a legislation that allows this. Let's make brothels legal, let's make pimping legal, let's make it possible for those who are in prostitution to register for social rights. That was 2002. Well, today you have more than 400,000 girls in prostitution in Germany. You have 1.2 million purchases of sex every 24 hours. You have 3,500 registered brothels and about the same amount unregistered. Guess how many of those who are working at the brothels in Germany are women from Germany or the daughters of German politicians? I'm just, making a point here. No. 98% are girls from 98% are girls from Albania, Macedonia, Romania, Bulgaria. Yes, you have girls from Nigeria too. And, that's quite what I see, wherever I go, it's always the most vulnerable who end up in prostitution, yes. So did I answer anything? Did I answer your question? I don't know. Very well. I did, good. Because I wanted to end up saying, the most important part of the legislation is, of course, providing the exit services and providing alternatives. And that's also the biggest challenge for me, traveling the world, having these discussions with other governments. We can have a good discussion regarding the legislation, but many times we end up in a discussion, or they actually saying, we cannot afford the Swedish model because we cannot afford to provide exit. And also, another obstacle, it would be suicide for us as politicians to provide economic resources to those who are in prostitution, because there are so many other vulnerable people in our country. So they would, why them and not me? So these are two real obstacles, of course, and we really need to address those issues in order, to make this come true. Yeah. Thank you.
So this raises a great point, which is economic and social rights for all. The Carter Center has been talking about this lately, about economic rights and social rights being equivalent to civil and political rights, that for human society to thrive, we have to see economic and social rights as the same priority as civil and political rights. And that this was the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it was adopted, right? After World War II. And yesterday there was a rally here in New York City that some of us participated in. And one of the staff members from the senator that is proposing to legalize prostitution in New York State, or decriminalize, that's the language they like to, full decriminalization, was exactly the second point you made, that unless we have universal health care, universal social services for all, how do you expect to provide services to this one population if we don't even have universal health care for everyone? So I said, okay, I'll make a deal with you. We will all get behind universal health care, and I promised to bring that request to the National Organization of Women, because I told them this event would be happening here. I said, let's make a trade. We'll all get on board with universal health care, universal equal rights, economic rights, if you all will agree that there would be special services and exit services for women exiting prostitution. Deal? Deal. Okay. So we'll have to follow up on that. Yeah.
Someone in the audience might wonder what I say when I have this argument given to me, and then I say it's a matter of human rights. This is a matter of human rights, and it's not okay for a country to say we can not afford it. Human rights are not optional, they are universal. So,
Yes, and let me just say this, is that one of the, my goals as the Carter Center works on this is to talk to the human rights organizations that have unfortunately lined up with the full decriminalization proposal. Come forward, that's a good question. The human rights organizations. And so what would you like to say to the human rights organizations on this line, that full human rights are due to every human being. So shouldn't we really embrace that idea and hold our human rights organizations to this idea that we need to be thinking about human beings as whole human beings? And
Well, I wasn't going to speak to that, but I can. I think we've got some. I think we do have some major human rights organizations that unfortunately are very misinformed. I'm being polite here. Wanting a full decriminalization for, and what that means is it means for the exploited person, it means for the sex buyer, and it means for the trafficker. So that's full, right? And so the Nordic model is just is still criminalizing the trafficker, also penalizing the sex buyer, and obviously the only point where the pro-prostitution lobby and I agree, which is exploited people shouldn't be incarcerated. Okay, but the way that I feel like one of the ways, because I've heard every excuse over the last two decades of my work of why, none of this is going to work and so on and so forth. So it's not really complicated at all. So if you penalize the sex buyers, and I mean monetarily, and you use that money to provide much needed and under-resourced exit services for women and girls, then that is the solution. It can't maybe be your main stream of funding, but Norma Hoteling in San Francisco, California, here in the United States, innovated the first offender prostitution program, or what we called FOP. And we replicated it all over the state and the country. We won the Innovations in American Government Award by the Ford Foundation. This was over 15 years ago. This is not that complicated, but there's an implementation process that needs to be paid attention to, and that is this: that those funds need to be circled back into exit resources and not into the general coffers or the general fund. So that's a simple solution. It's not rocket scientists here, not rocket science stuff. So that was all I had. Maybe anything else?
Lauren, this is a really good microphone because introduce yourself.
Lauren Hirsch from World Without Exploitation. So this is such an interesting panel, and I'm really, really hoping that this broadcast actually makes its way into onto people's screens, because it's really important stuff. I also was at the rally yesterday. Some folks in this room were at the rally as well. And I guess I'm really curious, because I think we're having a problem with public opinion on this issue. And so I'm really curious, from your perspective, what were some of the messages that resonated with people as you began to shift the law in Sweden? What was the communication strategy with the general public that began to move the needle? That's the piece for me that I think is so critical in the US. It's sort of wild that it's so critical, because we're in this moment where there's so much pushback on male violence. There's so much pushback on privilege and male entitlement, and yet we want to legalize, not we definitely don't, but we're pushing to legalize a trade that is basically predicated on inequality, male violence, and entitlement. So I'm really curious about the messages that resonated.
Thank you. Well, there was many years of this public discussion in Sweden. So this was a topic that the Swedish citizens got used to listening to for many years. And, there were pros and cons and so on, and people got informed, I would say. Then once the legislation was decided, we also put the issue of gender equality in the curriculum for schools from young ages. We had, of course, educational programs for police officers, prosecutors, judges. We had some high-profile sports persons, men, come out to say that real men don't buy sex. We did awareness campaigns like that. And of course, when the law first came into force, it was about 50-50. Today it's about 80%. But I do want to tell you, if you don't know this already, about the results from France, because there was a Ipsos survey just done in France, and the results are extraordinary. It shows that 78% of the French people are behind the French law, and that 74% of French people consider prostitution, or buying sex rather, a form of violence. And this shows that, you know, having a public discussion, making people aware that it's not, you know, Julia Roberts, Pretty Woman. It's a disgusting business behind the scene. We're not talking about two people on equal terms making, you know, a deal. It's always an inequality in this.
You know, and then the other thing that we were talking about right before the panel that Shay brought up was, you know, the other thing that's happening while there's this real wonderful insurgence of women speaking out about violence against themselves. Okay, so there's Me Too, there's all of this happening, right? Time's up, you know. But at the same time, there is the other abolitionist movement is fighting over incarceration, okay? So when we find some of the big foundations like Open Society funding all of this, tackling over criminalization, which is a great thing, right? We don't want people filling the prisons. We want to de-incarcerate America. We have the largest prison population in the world. It's really shameful, our history with incarceration, especially for people of color. So this is happening at the same time, right? So there's a lot of confusion. So the good liberal position and the good progressive position is de-incarceration, as depopulating the prison system. So one of the things that, Autumn, you had said that I really think we should talk about is we're not even necessarily talking about incarceration when we're talking about holding men accountable. Nobody is saying what the absolute thing must be in terms of criminalization. Some people talk about they do want men to go to prison, but you know, I think, you know, at least if we could start with asset seizure, you know, things like this, or fines, heavy fines, you know, then you could start creating deterrence. And I would love to get you both of your reaction to this, and Per-Anders also. Could we make common cause with the people who are working on the good program to de-incarcerate, to say we're not talking about locking people up necessarily. Now, of course, there are criminals with patterns of conduct that have to be high on the list for incarceration, because, you know, so maybe we're talking about Johns, first offenders, whatever how do we create a hierarchy of punishment that is a meaningful, because what we want is a deterrent, right? Because we know that it works. We know that some kind of penalty actually does deter men from buying, which suppresses demand. So any thoughts on that?
So what I would say to that, and the reason I use the word penalize when I talk about sex buyers, I've been educating sex buyers for at least 20 years of my life, or pretty close to it. And I do believe in education. I do believe that should cost deeply. I do believe that, again, that those should go back into services for women and girls, largely women and girls. But I think that one of the things that is missing here is that we have to address male violence against women from a male toxic behavior perspective. And I think the expert in the country is Peter Qualentine. And he does not just, like, there's across the country in the US at least, there's 2-hour programs for, $200 for men out buying sex. This is not what I'm talking about here. He has, I believe, an 8-week program that they have to go for 8 hours, 10-week program, 10-week program. And it's having males really look at that and becoming accountable for male violence against women. And I think that should cost dearly. I think the courts and the jurisdiction should not have to come out of pocket for that. I think that the money needs to be funneled right into that fund, like I said before. And that should come from the sex buyers. And then what we hear is, oh, well, we must provide a sliding scale. Look, you were out buying sex. Come on. You don't need a sliding scale. You know, and so you have to make payments over time or whatever you need to do. And I'm not a man hater. I have a wonderful, wonderful fiance. This is not about man hating, but this is about toxic male behavior of buying women and girls for sex. And that needs to stop. And you have to look at that comprehensively and put the money in the right places. What about you, Nikki? What do you think?
So I second all of that, but I just also want to say when we're looking at like depopulating their prison system, right? We're talking about largely people of color that are incarcerated in our country. Guess who's paying for sex? White men with disposable income, right? So it's like at the same time, it's like you know, all of a sudden, like we're worried about them going to jail. They've never gone to jail. They're never going to go to jail. Like realistically, like let's be honest here, right? Like when we're looking at that, it's like, you know, so again, they're going to jump right on, again, you know, use their privilege to levy right onto this issue, like, right? So like we can't criminalize us, you know, like, come on. Like they're never going to go to jail for buying sex, but they should be hit in their pockets. Like, you know, if they feel like they have money to throw around to pay for access to vulnerable people's bodies, guess what? That money can be used to provide services for those vulnerable people so that they don't have to be in that position. Because that's what it's about, right? And so it's interesting because, again, you know, I agree, but guess who's in jail? Like prostituted women of color, right? And men of color. And like we look at now too, even, you know, and I'm not a, you know, I don't hate law enforcement, but they're not my favorite people either. And like looking at like what happens sometimes now, and like we're seeing this with like all of a sudden like law enforcement going, you know, targeting demand, right? But guess who's being picked up in these demand operations? Poor people of color. Right? When we know that's not who's paying for sex, right? So it's like, I think we really need to like, you know, really target demands and not use these operations as ways to clean up the neighborhood and fill our prison system, right? So I think, and like, you know, I know people I'm probably not helping the cause right now, but like, that's the reality of what's happening, right? And so like, we need to be really targeting people who are paying for sex and not like using it, you know, as a way to, you know, boost our prison population.
And when the owner of the New England Patriots is arrested, there's an example. You know, maybe somebody needs to go to jail to, you know, I mean, I agree. I think that's a really great point. I mean, one of the research, bit of research we could do is who's really being, you know, on the buying side, who's really the pimps and the buyers, which ones, you know, that we know about the racial disparities in our justice system, criminal justice system, right? So, and this is one of the points that President Carter talks about. When he talks about this issue, he says, you know, the cops, the sheriff, they all know where the brothels are, where the thing is going on. The privileged men, they get a pass. You know, this is something that has to be tackled. And I wonder in Sweden, how did you approach the issue of criminalization of buyers and then pimps, traffickers? Was it heavily relying on incarceration? Was it asset seizure? Was it fines? What do you think is a mix that you have noticed is an important part of the policy?
There is prison in the scale if you get convicted for buying sex, but I think there's been very few persons going to jail for buying sex, and you know, putting someone in jail is not, you know, anything that we want. We don't want them to buy sex. Period. Stop doing that. So. And I didn't say this before, an important part of our legislation too is, you know, to provide therapeutic for those who are buying sex. So there are, you know, places for them to go, but it's voluntarily. I think the French law, the judge can order them to go to John schools, but in Sweden it's voluntarily. But a lot of the sex buyers, especially those who are trying to save their marriage after getting caught, they go to these John schools. We also have something that I'm very proud of, and it's called Preventel, which is a service that one of our big university hospitals provides, where you can call 24 hours, 24/7, and talk if you have, an urge to buy sex or buy sex from children and so on. And you can be anonymous and talk to them, and they have super good results, Preventel. So putting this in place, trying to prevent people from committing crime, that's the most important. Yeah.
Can I ask you, what are the penalties in the Swedish system?
It's up to 1 year if you're buying sex from a person who is older than 18. But most common is that you will be paying fines, and that's depending on how much you make. So if someone who is, VIP gets caught buying sex, he will be paying a lot of money, that's for sure, yes.
Wonderful. Well, one of the things I did want to cover, unless someone has an immediate point, is just the scale of the problem. And I wanted to recognize Lauren Hirsch, who spoke earlier, as a co-host for our event tonight. And on the website, World Without Exploitation, there are some facts and statistics that are useful. And one of the ones that really caught my eye when we talk about the sex trade and the incentives to actually be a trafficker and a exploiter. Well, first, that the average age of women in prostitution is under 15. And Ruchira Gupta, who runs another wonderful organization, Apne Aap, said yesterday in her panel that in India, the average age of people in the sex trade are between 9 and 13. 9 and 13, and almost all girls. In the US, between 13 and 15, it's average. So when we're talking about legalization and decriminalization and choice, my question to those who propose full decriminalization and this idea of sex work is a choice and it's a job like any other, if women are entering the sex trade between the ages of 9 and 15, do we call that consent? What happens when they turn 18? There was a wonderful play that was put on last year at the Carter Center with World Without Exploitation's sponsorship called After 18. What happens on that magical day when this girl turns 18? Is she suddenly giving consent? This is a point that is often raised by this pro-sex worker organizations. And I think that statistic is important for people to keep in mind, that this idea of the pretty woman, this kind of glamorized sex work narrative it's a unicorn. It's a very, very misleading idea, and we have to remind people of that. The other thing that on the World Without Exploitation fact sheet that blows my mind is that the average annual income made by traffickers in San Diego, again, my hometown, is $670,000 annual income, average. So if you're a good, have a basic understanding of economics and how a market is created and what fuels a market, if you have a way of making that much money every year, there are going to be a lot of people. So you can arrest a trafficker today, a person who is the trafficker, and 5 minutes from now, there'll be someone else taking their place, right? There is such a high incentive to do that work, to be the exploiter. But according to Justice Department statistics, the only intervention that really suppresses demand is arresting buyers. It's the one thing that actually deters men, that affects the supply and demand. So this is the question, we know this, that penalizing or arresting buyers is the one thing that works. So we have to pursue this. There's really no alternative. And if we decriminalize, then you're taking that tool out of the toolbox. We decriminalize sex buying. Any thoughts about that as we wrap up? How do we make that case, both about the idea of consent? What does consent really mean if women don't have actual choices? And the strategies that we know actually work.
So when we're talking, consent is, like we were talking about, it's two people on two, like, level playing fields, right? Which we know that is not where prostitution takes place, right? People that are being prostituted are coming from a position of vulnerability. And like, even when we talk about consent, I was talking about this with some of the law enforcement I work with. A lot of our, like, when we're looking at, this Me Too movement and how, like, on college campuses across our country, right? It's like, if they've had too much to drink, they're not capable of consenting, right? Like, I'm dealing with a lot of women that are, like, really, like, heavily, like, engaged in illegal street drugs, and you know what I mean? Like, but they're capable of consenting, right? Like, and it's like, that blows my mind. But it's because people in prostitution are looked at as someone else, and they don't really matter, right? Because we're talking about low-income people, we're talking about people of color that we've just discarded as, like, not being valuable in our society, right? And so it's almost like the violence that they're experiencing, they deserve, is how it's looked at, which is disturbing on so many levels, right? There's some of our most vulnerable people in our country that, like, people have just decided that we don't care about, which is really disheartening for me. And, as for, taking that tool away, it's the only effective tool that we have, right? And it's like, when we're talking about, like, the legalization or decriminalization, and I heard you saying how people are saying how the Swedish law doesn't work, right? And it's like, but when you're looking at studies, right, it's like legalization doesn't work, right? It, like, brings in trafficking, violence against women goes up, and I don't know where this, like, narrative comes from. It's like the pro-sex work lobby just makes up whatever they want, goes with it, and people are like, yes. Honestly, like, I don't understand where it actually comes from. And so it's like looking at these studies and actually, like, getting this information, like, to people accurately, I think is so important. And even, when you referred to the craft thing, I was talking about something the other day, and it's like, even that, it's like, he's caught paying for sex with trafficking victims, and everybody's like, poor guy, like, we should just legalize it so he can do that without any consequence. It's like, what? Like, right? What about these vulnerable people that he's harming, right? But it's like, because we are, because patriarchy exists, right? It's like everything that is in place to protect these men, right? It's like people in prostitution are disregarded, I'm hoping that this decriminalization in New York doesn't go anywhere, and I guess my thoughts, which probably weren't very rainbows and sunshine for people.
Well, it was for me. So, so I think, what we sometimes don't want to look at, and as you mentioned, Karen, that there's not enough studies around the harms and the violence and the death of prostituted persons. And so, if it's okay, I just want to read a little bit from what I read at the march. I'll keep it really quick. And I said, I supplant myself back to over 2 decades ago when I exited to let you know what I believed upon exiting, and more importantly, what I know now. Back then, I told myself I was empowered, I earned a lot of money, and I made my own schedule. Those idiots that do the 9-to-5 thing, I'd tell myself. What I could not look at was the truth. The harms, the violence, and near-death experiences I endured during prostitution. Why? My psyche would have split into a million pieces if I had told myself the truth about the brutality of prostitution. Friends, it takes a while to unpack that type of trauma. I bring you my truth today. I stand here and I sit here today, for those no longer with us, I call it, quote unquote, death by prostitution. Hashtag that, and please think deeply about that. And it is a real hashtag, by the way, check it out.
Thank you. That's really, really beautiful and moving for you to share that with us. And I think that's what we can't lose sight of, is that there is a narrative that's claiming experience that is not reflective of what most people in this situation are facing. It is a glamorized narrative that is doing a disservice to those who, as you say, can't speak for themselves now. And what about the millions in the future that will be harmed if we get this wrong? So thank you very much. I think what we'd like to do, just as we wrap up, is to think about what actions can we take to push for more resources for research and the care and exit services that are needed. And I would like to issue a call to our friends in the Swedish government to join with us, and maybe next year at CSW, we'll have a large event in the UN headquarters dedicated to this issue of ensuring access to, and I like this idea that we should frame this as a human rights requirement, that economic and social rights of the whole person would mean that, yes, we must have universal health care for all in our society, and that would include, just like domestic violence survivors need specialized programming, so should sex trade survivors have specially designed programming, right? And that brings up one last point I wanted to make earlier. But there was a time when domestic violence, that violence against women in the home, was seen as a private matter, right? And remember, we all worked for years so that violence against women would be a state crime, a crime against the state, that the state could act to prevent a man or to penalize a man for harming a woman in domestic setting, right? This is pretty new. It used to be only if the woman pressed charges would he be criminalized. But that has thankfully been changing, right? Jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And this is very similar. Why should a person who is so fragile, so, like you say, on the verge of having their psyche split into a million pieces, be the one to have to say, I'm being harmed and I need out? That we need to see prostitution in that light, that this is inherently harmful. So can we think about next year as doing something very specific on this topic?
Well, I'm not the person in charge, unfortunately, but I will do everything I can, and I'm sure that my government will be very positive to that. And actually, I think that more countries would be happy to join. May I just tell you that the Swedish government and the French government on the 8th of March made a decision to have a joint diplomacy against human trafficking for sexual exploitation and against prostitution. And I am so happy for this agreement between our countries. And we're now going to sit down together and make a detailed strategy on how to work to push this really strong in Europe and globally also. And so I'm sure that the French government will be interested too.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Do we have, what do we have here? It's, we've got 10 minutes. So we're going to open up for any questions.
Hi, I'm Melanie Hilton from the Carter Center. I've heard the word safe a few times, and with regard to services, it's projected that by 2050, 68% of the world's population will be living in urban spaces and cities. and there's been a global push towards safer cities for women, UN Habitat's new urban agenda, and a huge investment in gender-responsive public services. Even if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, gender-responsive public services is an important indicator towards achieving gender equality. Now, especially in urban sites, gender-responsive services often come at the cost, very high cost for women and girls who are being prostituted. They don't exist as far as those services are concerned. So when we're talking about services, in addition to having specific services for women and girls who hope to exit the sex trade, how can we make sure that existing services that target women and girls, especially those that help create a safe city for women and girls, do no harm for women and girls already in the sex trade? And Ambassador, what can Sweden do to convince those governments that are heavily invested in this new urban agenda to ensure that their policies and initiatives are doing no harm as a minimum?
Saved by a big bang. Well, that's an interesting question, and I think I would have to think about it for a little longer, but and I will do that. I will think about it, and I will have a discussion with you on how to include this in the discussions that I'm having as a representative for the Swedish government, because it's an important point you're making. Yes. So sorry I cannot be more specific.
Other questions or comments from our?
I'd love to know what you. Hello, I'm Sonia Osorio with the National Organization for Women. And as we continue this battle here in New York to prevent full legalization of the sex trade, what do you suggest is a good way to talk about the issue that, this question keeps coming up. It's like, if you are going to criminalize the men and they run off, you're taking away my livelihood. I mean, it's already criminalized, but there's this issue, and it came up with Sesta Fosta as well, is you're drying up this whole goal of reducing the demand for paid sex. Yes, over time is a great idea, but how do we answer those in prostitution, their questions about how it's going to impact them in the very near term?
I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think, in terms of Fosta Sesta, that wasn't targeted towards women currently in the sex trade, for one thing. If you want to go to the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women's website on Fosta Sesta, it will break down. That was targeted mostly at online venues. So that would be how I would answer that piece. And, part of it is I think the majority of prostituted persons, I know a study of 854 women in 9 countries by Dr. Melissa Farley and company, 89% of prostituted women wanted to exit. So what I would say to that, is the most people in prostitution don't want to be there. I think the bigger issue is to have the resources when those choose to exit. One thing that's come up a lot was I talk about the Nordic model is the Nordic model doesn't force people out of prostitution, right? The exploited persons, the prostituted persons are simply not penalized or criminalized, period. So we actually agree. The pro-prostitution, the abolitionists, or whatever we want to call ourselves, agree. The Nordic model does not force women and girls out of prostitution. It simply offers the exit strategies and resources and services to do so when they're ready. So what I would say to answer your question specifically, Sonia, is we make public policy on the majority and not the minority.
And I think funding exit services, I mean, I think that is, 90% of it, right? Is that we are, decriminalizing for exploited people and putting higher fines and penalties. We need to be providing exit services for people and funding them, more importantly. Because, in the wake of FOSTA, SESTA, I'm going to be honest, and, there was a lot more, we saw a lot more women at our drop-in center, and I have this, it goes back to this debate of like prostitution online is safer. No, it's not, right? Like prostitution is inherently violent behind a hotel closed door or on the streets. And so for us, it was like we were seeing a lot more women at the drop-in center. We weren't accounting for that, right? But again, there were people that were coming in for support services and wanting to exit. So in our eyes, it's not a bad thing, right? So it's, I guess, funding those services.
I want to just emphasize as we close this point that Autumn just made. What we've noticed with the discussion or the discourse around decriminalization is that the human rights case that's being made by human rights organizations, it's my body, my choice. This is my preferred way to make a living. And in my discussions with people who call themselves sex workers, what is interesting is I'll sometimes get to a point where they say, well, this is going to take away my livelihood, my clients. This is the answer that I always find myself coming back to with what Autumn just said is, when you look at the statistics and understand that women in the sex trade and girls are between the ages of 9 and 15, you see this on a global level, that the legal and social responses that we have to devise are for those most harmed. We do not make law, we do not make policy for a few privileged people who say, I was in a little bit of a Twitter battle yesterday after the rally, and one of the issues, you were on there, one of the people talking to me on Twitter was saying, but I want to do this is my choice. I said, well, but we don't make laws. And she said, I could do it or I could choose. I have a PhD. I could choose to do it. I could not do it. And I said, well, good for you. Then we're not talking about you, right? I'm not here to interfere with your life and your choices, your the things that you've put together to make your life interesting. That's not what we're doing here. We make laws and certainly global treaties, human rights treaties, for the most harmed, the most vulnerable. And so we can't and this is where the human rights organizations have gone wrong. It's individual rights, it's my right, my body, my choice. We don't say this for selling organs, do we? We don't say I can sell my organ, because we know if there is a market for selling organs, if I say, well, I'm going to go ahead, my family is in poverty, so I'm going to sell all my organs so that my children can go to college. We don't allow that because we know what it would do. We know that a market would be created and people would be tempted to do that. It would affect the poor, it would affect the marginalized, right? How is that different from this? It's really not different from this. So that's kind of how we always end up in these discussions, but yeah.
I have to say something. I met this woman in prostitution in Colombia, and we were talking. And prostitution in Colombia is legal, but there is a discussion going on in the government to either legalize or maybe go towards the Nordic model. And she said that being in prostitution, being in this business is miserable. But imagine if this business was made legal, then the government would never offer persons like me with no education and my children any other opportunities. They will always say, you can always sell your body.
Very good answer. Good. Thank you for that. So now we're going to close. Any closing thoughts that anybody would like to make? Registered our our hope for next year. Gregoire, please come. Come. You have to speak on the microphone because otherwise we won't hear you. Come forward. Yes, please. Use the microphone and introduce yourself. Look at the camera. We're broadcasting.
So, Grégoire Thierry from CAPI International, the Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution. Sorry for being so late, first of all, because there are so many clashing agendas that we will have, and it was a bit far to reach here as well. I have a question about the mobilization of political willingness and financial resources for the exit programs. And my question is it really possible to expect political support and financial consistent support for exiting when prostitution, I mean the act of being sold, is still criminalized? I come with the French experience where we obtained the decriminalization of prostituted persons and the recognition of prostitution as a violence, an obstacle to the constitutional principle of gender equality. And it's because prostituted persons are decriminalized. It's because prostitution is recognized as a violence and an obstacle to equality that very logically then the state has to provide exit support. And I'm always a bit embarrassed with the situation in the US because I think that as long as the victims will be criminalized, it means that prostitution is not recognized as a violence, as a gender equality obstacle. It's recognized as something bad, but who is the bad person in the process? The prostituted person, the buyer, the pimps, the three of them, we don't know. And I think it's key, and when we look at what happens now, I was at the rally, which was very successful, so congratulations to all. But I have a big question when it comes to the US. Isn't it our responsibility to champion even more, first of all, as a top priority, the decriminalization of prostituted persons? Because I feel that those who can obtain the decriminalization of the selling of sex or of being sold for sex, those will obtain the rest of the model they advocate for. If we leave it to the sex workers movement, if they obtain the decriminalization of sex workers, they will obtain the sex work model. So that's a question I still have. I don't have the answer because I really feel that we can't mobilize real political and financial support if we don't first obtain the decriminalization of the victims. I don't know what you think.
And I think you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the climate in the U.S. is one that such in some jurisdictions we're still arresting children for their own child abuse, which prostitution is. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to start there, but it's a different, as you know, a political system, and we've got states that are jurisdiction over different states, and it's not into federal law at this time, and there's 50 states doing 50 different things at any particular time. But I believe you're absolutely right, because I always say prostitution itself is a violation of human rights, and it really is. It's a violation of a woman and child, man, boy, of anybody's human rights, because there's so many different treaties cover not to be bought and sold in so many different ways, even as far back as 1949 and before. So, yeah, I just think that I mean, I'm going to keep it kind of transparent here, and no offense to any politicians that are listening, but at least in my case, the buyers for me were politicians. So even when I go and do my public policy advocacy as a survivor, sometimes it's a bit awkward because I know that the women and the men in the room are the ones buying the women, because they were the ones that bought me. So it's really about how do we create men, and particularly politicians, and there are quite a few in the U.S., to really help us move this forward where exploited persons are not criminalized. So you're right that we got to start there, but we can't do that until we also continue with stopping it where the money starts, which is with the sex buyers. So my other quote would be, there isn't always a trafficker, but there's always a sex buyer. So let's start there. Let's get the money in, and let's stop arresting women and girls, and largely women and girls of color, for their own abuse.
No, that covers it. Yep. I agree wholeheartedly. Well, I will say in Boston, in Massachusetts, we are working on legislation that would decriminalize for the prostituted person. It never seems to get very far. I'm just gonna, and I think again, because, we're protecting men's rights to buying, women and girls, because we have a full system of criminalization right now in Massachusetts. So it's illegal to buy, it's illegal to be sold, it's illegal to sell. And so we're just working to try to decriminalize for the prostitute person currently. But again, and we've been working on it, and it never seems to get very much traction. And I think it's because of culturally where we are in the United States too. There's a lot of I hear people, refer to it as like the happy hooker, idea that this is what people want to be doing. And so it's like culturally, I don't think people understand really that this is violence. And then I also think it's because of who's experiencing this violence. Even if they do understand, they don't care.
And then in the state of Colorado, we can't even get the decriminalization of the Safe Harbor Act. So that's basically not arresting children. This is our third year in having that fail, even for children. So forget women, because the Safe Harbor can't even, and that's other states too.
Yeah, so back to Sonia's question, I think that come on up if you want to ask a question, I need you to speak on the microphone, is this all goes together, and again, back to the Swedish experience. They've done all those different pieces of it together because it really isn't, it's a package deal, including the exit services. Come and introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Lima James. I'm coming from an organization called Lifeway Network. We provide housing for women survivors of trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking. My question is a large question, but I've been sitting here happily hearing all the great information, but as you can tell from my voice, just very mad and frustrating at the same time, things that are not changing as fast as we would like it to. So my question is around, Ambassador, you talked about attending an event either, I think today or yesterday, at the UN, and those conversations are, around sex work and the taking away the livelihood, or how that's good, or, those kind of pieces. How do we bring those people to the table to change that conversation? Because it is such a shame to have an entity within the UN, because people look at it as setting an international standard, right? So it's such a shame, and how do we bring those people to at least have a conversation with us? I'm sure it's happened, but nothing has changed. So any thoughts or response would be great.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, it's challenging to listen to discussions like that within the UN, and Sweden being providing the UN with a lot of financial funds, and at the same time having a policy that says that we do not accept the term sex work. We see prostitution as sexual exploitation. This is challenging, of course. So what we do, we try to raise this issue on a very high level and have the discussion. But we must also remember that the organizations are also doing a lot of good things, and taking away the funding would not be the right medicine. So we just need to have good discussions and try to bring the best arguments to the table. That's what we can do, I think.
Well, we might come back to that question. Maybe we'll start petitioning Sweden and the other governments that accept the Swedish approach to at least threaten funding. I mean, sometimes threatening funding can go a long way. But anyway, it's another discussion for another day. Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. So grateful to each of you for participating. And Ambassador SUNESSON, thank you so much. And thanks to Laura for the research that gave us some meat to chew on, and we very much want to hear more from you about how research can be, additional research can be conducted to shed more light on this question. And I'd like to thank one more time World Without Exploitation and the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and the government of Sweden for co-sponsoring this event, and to the National Organization of Women for making their beautiful offices available to us and reconfiguring the room to make this a really comfortable conversation. Thank you very much. And goodbye to our online audience. Thank you very much. Thank you.